All right, so we've got a whole stack of readings here about democratic systems. Looks like someone's been doing their homework. You know, it's always interesting to me. It's like we live under these systems, but we kind of take them for granted. Like, how do they actually work, you know?
Yeah, it's like the operating system of our societies, right? And like with your phone, you don't really think about it until it crashes.
Ooh, that's a scary thought and a good point. So before our democracy crashes, let's make sure we understand how it all works. Now, you highlighted this idea of consent of the governed. That seems to be like the core of what makes a democracy a democracy.
Yeah, it's the bedrock. It really is. The foundation. Because, I mean, imagine a government trying to assert its authority without the backing of the people.
Right. It's just like immediately illegitimate. Right.
You're like trying to build a house on sand.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You need that foundation of legitimacy, that sense that we, the people, you know, that we are the ones who grant power to the government.
So it's more than just voting every few years, right? It's got to be. What are some of the other things that are really important to making this whole system work?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's about participation, not just like passive acceptance. And one of the most important pillars is this principle of people power. It's the understanding that political authority doesn't come from like some divine right or a single party or whatever. It flows directly from the people.
Right. It's government of the people, by the people, for the people. Like, it's easy to say, but actually putting it into practice.
The whole other thing.
Yeah, totally.
And that's where this idea of political equality comes in. Because it's not enough to just say, like, yeah, everyone has a voice.
Yeah.
You have to create a system where everyone's voice can actually be heard. And not just heard, but like heard on an equal playing field.
So it's more than just like one person, one vote then, right? Because even if you have that, there are so many other things that could get in the way of someone actually having their voice heard.
You're totally right, 100%. Think about access to education, to economic opportunity, even just like the ability to take time off to go vote or to campaign or something. All these factors can either empower people or prevent them from participating in a meaningful way.
And what good is having a voice if no one's listening, right? So that's got to be a part of it too.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial. A healthy democracy, it thrives on this back and forth, you know, the messy, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately essential exchange of ideas.
Yeah, the marketplace of ideas.
That's it. And people need to be able to hold their leaders accountable, to voice their concerns, to engage in constructive criticism without fear of, you know, being silenced.
Right, constructive being the key word there. I'm always reminded of that Voltaire quote. I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Which is interesting because it leads into this other core tenet of democracy, which is majority rule, but it's more nuanced than that, isn't it?
It is. Because it's majority rule, but
there's a but in there.
There is a big but. And that but is all about protecting minority rights. Because imagine, you know, just whatever the majority decides, that's it. End of story. No matter the consequences for everyone else. That could lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
Yeah, history's full of those examples.
Exactly. So a healthy democracy has to recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every single person. Not just the people who agree with you or who look like you or whatever, but everyone. You've got to build in safeguards to make sure those minority voices aren't silenced, that their rights are protected and their interests are still taken into consideration.
Which, practically speaking, shapes how the whole system is structured, right?
100%. And that's how we end up with all these different flavors of democracy. Because it's not one size fits all. You know, it can take many different forms, and each has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Right, like choosing the right tool for the job, I guess. You wouldn't use a hammer to fix a leaky faucet. So what are some of these different democratic tools we've got in the toolbox?
Well, I think one of the first big questions is who gets to wield those tools? You know, like who's actually making the decisions? And that's where we get into the difference between direct democracy versus representative democracy.
Right. So direct democracy, it's like ancient Athens, everybody gets a vote, right?
Yeah.
So in today's world, it'd be like, we're all voting on every single law, every policy, using our phones.
Can you imagine? It would be like a constant global town hall meeting going on 24/7. And look, it has a certain appeal, that direct engagement. It's very pure in a way.
Yeah, power to the people, right?
Exactly. But trying to scale that up to like millions, billions of people, I mean, you'd need to have a referendum every 5 minutes. It would be completely unwieldy.
Yeah, and who has the time for that, right? So that's where representative democracy comes in, I guess.
Exactly. Instead of everyone weighing in on every single issue, you elect representatives to, well, represent you, your interests, your values in the decision-making process.
Okay, so they're like our stand-ins. which sounds great, but what's to stop them from getting a little too comfortable up there in their ivory tower, becoming out of touch with the people they're supposed to be representing?
It's a huge concern. And that's why things like transparency, accountability, regular elections, they're so important in a representative system. You have to have ways of making sure those in power are answerable to the people who put them there.
And that there are ways to, vote them out if they're not holding up their end of the bargain.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. It's not just like you vote once and then you wash your hands of it,
Yeah, it's a lot more work than that.
Way more. Staying informed, being engaged in the process, holding your elected officials accountable. It's a constant thing.
Right. And it's not just about who's making those decisions, but like how those decisions are actually being made, right?
Oh, for sure. And that's where we get into another really important distinction, majoritarian versus consensus-based systems.
Okay, so we've got the who, now it's the how. So majoritarian, that's probably what most people are familiar with, right?
Yeah, it's like the political equivalent of a sprint. Think fast-paced elections, often with two big dominant parties, and a clear winner-takes-all approach.
Right, so it can be really efficient, especially if you need to make a decision quickly.
Exactly. But the downside is, it can also be pretty unforgiving. If your candidate doesn't win, or your party's not in power, you might feel like your voice just doesn't matter.
Like you're just totally out of luck until the next election rolls around.
Which can be really alienating. Especially in societies where there's already a lot of division, it can just make those divisions even worse.
Right, so it's efficient, but at what cost?
Exactly. And that's kind of the trade-off. Now, on the other hand, you have consensus-based systems, which are more like, I don't know, navigating a really complex maze, maybe.
Okay, so less of a sprint, more of a intricate waltz or something.
Yeah, something like that. You often have multiple parties, no one has a clear majority, so coalitions have to be formed, you have to compromise, you have to work together, and power is often shared more broadly.
So it takes longer to get stuff done, but maybe you end up with solutions that more people can get behind.
That's the hope. And it can be really good for representing a wider range of viewpoints, especially in diverse societies. But of course, it has its downsides, too. It can be slow-moving, prone to gridlock, and those compromises can sometimes feel a little,
watered down.
Yeah, this really the best we could come up with. So again, it's about trade-offs. There's no perfect system. It's just about figuring out which set of trade-offs you're willing to live with.
Right, because ultimately, these different models reflect different values, different ideas about the role of government, and even just different visions of what a just society looks like.
100%. And that brings us to, I think, another really crucial distinction. Liberal democracy versus social democracy.
So it's like, they're both democracies, they share those core principles, but they have really different ideas about what the government should actually be doing, what a just society actually looks like in practice.
Yeah, it's like, you can have two chefs, right? And they both have access to the same ingredients, but they're going to end up with very different dishes.
Totally. So liberal democracy, that's the one that really emphasizes individual freedom, right? Limited government.
Right. You can think of it as like a minimalist chef, They want to use the highest quality ingredients, but they don't want to overcomplicate things.
Less is more. Let the flavors speak for themselves.
Exactly. So you have maximum individual opportunity, maximum autonomy. The government's job is basically to protect those freedoms, make sure everybody's playing by the same rules, and then kind of step back. Let people figure things out for themselves.
So freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of markets, that's all central to this model.
Exactly. Those are the big ones. And to make sure those freedoms are actually protected, you need things like a really strong independent judiciary, a free press, journalists can actually report on what's going on without fear of being censored.
Keep everybody honest.
Exactly. And a system of checks and balances to make sure no one person or group can become too powerful.
Okay, so that all makes sense. But, what about the people who don't start the race on equal footing? Even if you have all those freedoms in place. Is that where social democracy comes in?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. It's saying okay, freedom is important, but freedom without the ability to actually exercise that freedom is kind of meaningless.
Right. It's great that you have the freedom to go see a doctor, but if you can't afford it, it doesn't really matter.
Exactly. So social democracies, they believe in using the power of government more actively to level the playing field, provide a safety net for those who might need it.
So universal health care would be an example of that, right?
Totally. Or affordable housing, education that's accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy. Robust social safety nets so people aren't just one job loss away from being out on the street.
So you're trying to create a system where everyone has more of an equal shot, regardless of what zip code they were born into.
Exactly. Give everyone the opportunity to reach their full potential, to live a good life. Now, of course, it's not without its critics. Some people argue it stifles individual initiative, that it creates an overly bureaucratic system, that it's unsustainable in the long run. And, these are all legitimate concerns. It's about finding that balance.
Right, between individual liberty and collective well-being.
Exactly. How much should the government be doing to promote equality? How much individual freedom are we willing to give up in exchange for that security? There's no easy answer.
And that's a debate that's happening all around us all the time. Whether we're talking about healthcare or education or the economy, it always comes back to these different visions of what role the government should play.
And that's a good thing. These debates, it's back and forth. That's the sign of a healthy democracy. It means people are engaged, they care about these issues, and that they're willing to grapple with these really complex questions about how we want to live together.
Right. Because it's easy to forget, but democracy isn't a spectator sport. It requires us to actually show up,
100%. It's about being informed, participating in the process, holding our leaders accountable, and, maybe even running for office ourselves one day. Who knows?
There you go. Now you're talking. So as we wwrap up this deep dive, what are some things that are really standing out to you?
For me, it always comes back to that idea of informed participation. Because what's the point of all this if we don't understand how it works? If we don't feel empowered to actually get involved and make our voices heard?
Because at the end of the day, we all have a stake in making sure this whole democracy thing works. It's not perfect, but it's the best system we've got.
Couldn't agree more. It's an ongoing project, constantly evolving, and it requires all of us to stay engaged, to keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future.
Well said. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, to say the least. It's given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
And hopefully it's done the same for everyone listening. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.